Let's create a more complex example this time, a notes application with user authentication and CRUD, create, read, update and delete operations. We'll use HTML, CSS, JavaScript along with the mock backend using a JSON server node package. So in this particular application, what you'll see is we'll have this website which has a username, password and login, and you can log in into this application. You'll see some notes. You can add a new note, you can edit a particular note, you can delete a note, and you can log out from this application and log in as another user and see their notes over here. So kind of create a session variable for your multiple users and have a database in the backend. So in this particular case, we'll have a backend application as well as the front end. So we are kind of building the entire stack just by using HTML, JavaScript and CSS. So to start this project, first thing that we need to do is let's create a folder, Notes app. So I've created this Notes app inside my HTML projects. Again, if you have not looked at the previous videos, I would highly recommend you to look at the to-do list app and the weather app before doing the Notes app. It will make your life much simpler. So the Notes app is the first application where we will have a backend, the most simplest backend possible, and also a front end. So here inside Notes app, I've created two folders, backend and front end. Don't worry, I've not written anything over here. Both are empty folders. So we're going to start from scratch. I'm going to take, first step is to create the backend. So I'm going to take my backend folder and inside that I'll create a new file. And this will be my backend database as well as backend system, everything. This is just like a mock backend. The way to do this is I'm going to call it database.json. So what it does is it has a bunch of data inside here as objects, and the first one is users. So for the Notes app, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we will have users and notes. Now this first structure will have the user structure inside there. I'll give this user an ID of 1. It's an object. Let's make sure that is there. And then I'll give it a username. To make it much simpler, I'll give this user the username of user1 so we can easily recognize it, and I'll give it a password, password of, you guessed it right, pass1. Keep it as simple as possible. So similarly, I'll create second user whose username and password is much more easier to guess. And then once I have these users, let's also create a database of notes. So I have notes database, and this notes has notes inside it. So first ID, unique ID of the first note is a 1, and this was created by user ID. Let's say we'll say 1. So this note was created by the first user here, user1, and the content of this note is this note was created by user1. That's what I'll call it. Copy this. I'll create a couple more with user ID 2 and 3 created by the same user, user1. I'll say this note 1, this note 2, and this note 3. Sure, commas are there. And then I'll add one more note for my user 2. This note 1 was created by user 2, something like that. So this is my database. Now if I want to run this database, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my terminal. I'll go to my folder desktop and this HTML projects, and inside that this one was called Notes app, and inside that I have backend. So inside this I have that db.json. Let's make it a little bigger so you can see. So to run this, first thing that I would need is I would need the JSON server. So if you do not have Node installed, I would highly recommend to go and have Node.js installed on your computer, because I'm going to use the Node package manager here, npm, and I'm not going to go in details of this. If you run this command npm something and it gives you an error, if you Google it, the first answer would be how to install it. So I'm not going to go into detail of that, but I'll say node install -g, which is global. I say globally install JSON server on this machine. So it's going to take a few minutes and install it. And once I have that, I'm going to run this server is using the command. Let's clear this out. So it's installed. It says that there is latest version of npm available. Mine is a little older. I can ignore that, but it's installed now. So I can just say JSON server watch db.json. So this will run my backend server. If it's completely running right now, all I have to do is I can take this, open a new as you can see, keep it side by side. It says that if I run this, it will give me the users. So I'm gonna increase this. So if you see, my user list is there, and if I run the other one, which is nodes, it will show me the nodes that are there. So it's pretty easy to create a backend server. This is how you create a backend server. Now next step, we're going to create the front end, which is HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So I'm going to keep these open, but I will keep it on the side. Go back to Sublime Text. So here in Sublime Text, I'm creating a new file now. So I just said new file, and in here I'm going to write the HTML code. So first step I'm going to do is do the doc type HTML to let the document know that it's a HTML type document. Next, as you already are familiar with, I'm going to give the HTML tags, which says that this is an HTML document which uses language English. Next, I'll create the head tag. Now inside the head tag, as I mentioned, we will have the meta tag, which talks about the character set we're going to use, in this case UTF-8. Then we set the viewport with width equal to device width. Initial scale is 1.0, so let it be used on both mobile and web version on desktops. Next I'm going to give title, which I would say notes app. Next I'll set the styles.css as the style sheet. I have not created this file, but I'm going to create it in a few seconds. Next I'm going to create the body, and inside the body, first I'm going to create the first container. Now this is a login form slash a notes taking application, so I want to first create, like I'm gonna h1 notes and create a login form here. So if you see in this particular case, in line number 12, let's go step by step. I created an ID auth section. So this is the authentication section, which has the form, login form in there. The first input type text is a username. I've given the ID username, placeholder username, and I've said this is required. So if I click the button, which is below here, login submit, if you set something required and it's not filled up, it will give you error. Input type password, ID password. So this is where the user enters the password. If I save this file, I'm going to save it in the front end, and I'm going to save it as index.html. And if I run it, you'll see I have username, password here, login. Next, I'm going to create the note section. So if you see here inside note section, I've specified class as hidden, because when the page loads first time, I don't want it to be displayed. Now I've set it as class as hidden. It will still show up because I've not created the CSS files yet. So it doesn't know what this class is, and it will still show this on the HTML form. I've created a button, which is logout button on the top, and I'm saying form ID note form, and I use the text area, which is a bigger input field, text field, where you can enter a lot of text. Note content, add a note here, and when you submit this, it adds a note to our database. So that's our form, and it will display all the notes under here ul id. This is something that we did similarly in one of the previous projects. So I'm going to save this and run this, and you'll see everything is here. Everything is visible right now. So the specific flow you've seen before is user will come first and do login, and after that the user will see all the note section, and they can add a note and delete notes and do all the other kinds of stuff. But right now it's showing everything here because we're just creating the basic HTML. Next, I'm going to go and also add the JavaScript. So before I forget, let's create those two files. This one is styles.css and the next one is script.css. Let's make sure we use the right word. Script.js. I can just go here. Actually, let me close this completely. I'm going to go back here, go to my notes app and pull this, open this entire notes app here, so I have all my files, backend and front end here. And then script dot, this is the JS file. So let's go to the styles and let's start writing the styles over here. We'll go with first the body. So for body, I've set font family as Arial Sans Serif. I've given a background color. I've display flex, justify content to center, align items to center. Height is 100 VH, which is a viewpoint height, so it's 100%, and margin of 0. I can go back and refresh it, and you'll see it's set. Next, I'm going to use the container, which is my, let's go open the index.html, the container here for this entire div. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give background white, padding 20 pixel, border radius 5 pixel, box shadow, and width of 300 pixels, something that we've seen before. Save this, refresh it, and you'll probably see that here the box the container has a style now. Next, h1, the notes app. I've given a margin of 0, 0 and 20 pixel, text align center. It will make notes in the center. Next, I have for the form display flex direction, column direction, which means these forms that I have, I don't want them to next to each other. I want them in a column format, and margin bottom is 20 pixels. So this will make it look like a column here. So that looks pretty clean. Next, I'm gonna do is for input, text area, and button, I'm gonna give a padding. Now I've grouped them together because these are some of the common ones which kind of I've repeated for input, text area, and button. So instead of writing it in each one of them, I've created a common style, and I'm setting padding, margin bottom, border, and border radius, so that will make it look a little nicer and clean. So next, I'm going to just focus on the button where I'm giving a background color, cursor, and border to it. So if you see, buttons will change and we'll have this blue color, which is this color that we've given. Next, I'm saying button hover. So if you see, currently it doesn't have any hovers. So I'm going to give that, and I refresh this, and now you'll see it has that hover style. Next, for the list items which the notes will be displaying, I'm saying list style is none, so it doesn't show the bullets, and padding is 0. So we will not see it over here because the list is here and there's no notes right now because we're not pulling things from the database. And for the list items, I'm saying background color, padding, margin, border, displays flex, justify content is space between, and align items center, border radius is 3 pixel. Just the basic. And finally, hidden. If you remember, this thing should be hidden when login is there. So I'm gonna initially set display to none. So when I do this, you'll just see the login page. So this looks pretty good already. It's coming along. Now all I have to do is connect. As soon as the user enters user1, pass1, and login, I want it to go to the form, and that magic is done through JavaScript. So I'm going to move my attention to script.js. I thought I renamed this. Let's try again. Okay, there you go. Perfect. And did I messed up? CSS script.cs gets renamed as JS, and there you go. So now we'll focus on this file. So inside the script.js, first we'll probably add our event listener that I'm saying as soon as the DOM content is loaded, I want to do this. What is this? First, I'm getting the login form by saying document.getEventById login form. So this will give me a handle to, let me open index.js, to this particular login form here. So I have that login form. Next, I'm saying username input. So wherever this username input is, which is username, document.get username. Password, I'm getting a pointer, a variable to the password, which is password input. I have authentication section, which is the auth section, which is this entire section, because when the user is logged in, I don't want to show this. I want to make this class as hidden and show this. So that's why I am getting a constant variable to that. Next, node section, which is this section. So again, this you probably realized I'm using it just so that I can hide and toggle between auth section and node section depending on when the user is logged in versus logged out. Notes form, I'm getting a handle to the notes form, which is right here, node form. Node content, which is the data that user enters to get to create a new node. That note list, which is the list of nodes at the bottom here, which will be displayed once we fetch it from the database. We have the logout button, which is the button right above here, logout button. And then what I'm doing is, once I have all these constants, I'm going to set the user to null. So when the web page in this particular case is loaded, I don't know who the user is. So, and everything is, if you have seen, if the page shows username, password, so I don't know who the user is. So until they log in, I'm going to set current user equal to null. Next, now whenever the login form button is pressed, which is this login button is pressed, whenever the submit event occurs, I'm adding event listener and I'm saying prevent the default event, which is when I click on this, it will just, it will not refresh, because if you remember, I've added that as required. But if I enter those information, so if you see it didn't do anything, it just refreshed the page because there is no submit activity. So in this case, I'm saying that when the user says submit, prevent the default action and log in with the user name that they have entered, its value and password. So I'm calling a function. So I'm going to define this function a little later. Let's go and add all the events first. Next, I have the logout button. So I'm adding a logout button, or when the user clicks in that logout button, which is this button here, I want to call the logout function, which again I'll write it later. I didn't want to add all the functionality in here. Next, node form add event listener. So there is a button whenever user submits a note. So for that, I'm adding a submit event listener here, saying that prevent the default and call the function add note. And once you've added the note, clear that particular field. So clear this text area and make sure the user can enter the next new note. So now once that is done, let's go and look at these functions. So again, for login, since I'm calling the backend API inside there, I'm going to make it an async function, asynchronous function called login. I take username and password as inputs here, and here I'm going to say get the response by calling the API, which is this localhost 3000 users. If you remember, we created the backend. Now in this case, if you pass the username as whatever user entered and password whatever they entered, it's going to get a response from that JSON. Now the backend database that we created, it will check if the username password is there. The JSON server gives you all these capabilities for free. You don't have to write a single line of code. So once it does that, it will check if that user is available. If the user is there, it's going to give that user back. And if the user dot length is 0, which means if this was the user that logged in, this is the data we'll get back, and which means the length of the array that we get is greater than 0. That means current user is whichever user we got, we're going to set that current user to that user. And then I'll say show the note section, because now the user is logged in. I want to show the note section and load the notes from the database. So I've created two different functions from them. First to show the note section, and then second to load the notes. If you enter some random username password, it will say alert invalid user or password. So it'll ask you to enter again. And if there was an error fetching data, it will say error logging in. There was some other server error. So that's what we've taken care in this login function. Next, I'm going to write the logout function. So when logout happens, all I'm going to say is current user is equal to null, because I want to set the current user, which is the global variable here, to null, and hide the node section. So when you say hide node section, it will show the login again, which we'll see in a little while because I've written that later, the hide node section. So we have still to write show node section, load nodes, and hide node section. So let's look at load nodes first. So the load nodes, what it does is it calls the backend API localhost 3000 nodes for the user ID that the user ID is currently logged in. So I'm passing the current user dot ID. So what it does is it whichever user is logged in is going to take their user ID and pass it to there. So if you see here, when the user logs in, we get a response back. The response is set to users, and current user is where we set that particular user. And based on the user's ID, we are calling the load nodes. So load nodes, we pass the user ID and get their nodes. So this will give me all the nodes. For example, in this case, if this user 1, it will give me all these nodes, because if you see user ID is 1 has all 3 nodes. So that's what we will get, and I'm writing a separate function for displaying those nodes, and I pass these nodes over there, so to create that UI. If there was an error, I'll just say error. Next, I'm going to say display nodes, which is this function. So if for each and every nodes that we have initially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the nodes list. Inner HTML is empty, so that's what I'm going to set. So in here, if you remember this nodes list, which we got fetched using the nodes list here, I am setting that to blank, because what if there was another user who logged in, or some data that is already around there. So I'm making sure the HTML content is completely empty. Then I go through the nodes. For each of the node, I am creating a li element, and I'm setting the text content to node.content, which is node.content. So I'm setting this as the li element. Next, I am creating a constant edit button, so user can edit it, and when that button is clicked, I'm gonna create a function called as edit node prompt, and I'll pass that node there. Next, same thing for delete. I'm going to create a button, assign the text as delete, and when that button is clicked, I will say delete node and pass the node ID. And then finally, I'll append that to the li item, edit button and delete button, and to the node list, I will append the li child. So that's what I'm doing. Next, the add node function. So every time user presses that add node button, which we created here, when the add node button is clicked, this function will be called again async, because we're going to pass this node to the backend server. We're not saving it locally. So if, again, we'll first check, did user enter anything in the field? If they did not, just return it saying that nope, nothing. And then once if there is some data, I'm saying the response, I'm calling the URL, the nodes, and I'm passing I'm calling a method post. So there's two types of methods, get and post. Post is used usually when you send some data packaged along, so which needs your headers, content type application JSON, because you're sending JSON data. And for the body of that particular data that you're sending, I'm saying JSON.stringify user ID. So I have to specify, because if you see here, our nodes needs ID, user ID, content. So user ID is current user.id, content is content, and this ID, since it's ID field, it's automatically incremented by 1. So we don't have to worry about that. So I'm saying constant new node, await for the response. So it will take this data, send it to this URL, and wait for it to give the new node. And once the new node is fetched, it will call the load nodes function, which we have specified here, which will fetch all the nodes and display it for that user. If there was an error, it will give error. So that takes care of adding node. Next, editing the node prompt. So every time here, when you press the edit button on a node, it will call this edit node prompt function and pass the node along, and it will here we have created a new content. I'm creating a prompt, a pop-up prompt, When I'm saying edit the note and I'm passing the note content, so user can actually edit. So if new content is not equal to null, I'm calling edit note id dot new content. So this will call the function edit note, which is this one, and pass the id and the new content. So this will again call the backend service for a particular note id. So when you're creating new, you don't have to pass the id of it because that note doesn't exist. But if you're editing something, you have to pass the id of that note, call the method patch, and headers are same, and body will be, you don't have to pass user id because you know which user it is already. All you're changing is the content. The user is only changing the content, so you just update the content. Again, call the load nodes, which will refresh the nodes, and if there's error, it will say error editing. Next thing is deleting note. So you remember we created a delete button here. So when this delete is pressed, this delete function is called. What this delete function does is it will call this and notes function with id, and this time for method, for deleting you say method is delete, for updating it's patch, for creating it's post. So you probably got that. And then I'm loading the nodes, so you don't have to do much here. It will just delete that and will reload your nodes here again. Finally, show notes section. So if you remember this function which we wrote here, when user logs in, I have to show the note section. So here I'm saying auth section dot class list add hidden. So for the authentication section, I'm making it hidden, whereas for the note section, I'm removing the hidden class. So it will remove this class hidden from here and add it to this here. Was gonna say how it does using JavaScript here, but that's what it does. So it will switch between showing the note section and hiding the auth section. So let's run this. This is all the code that you need for running this. So I'm going to go ahead, refresh it, go here, enter, let's say Vivian Arana, password is Vivian Arana 1, login. Oh, invalid username or password because my database doesn't have any users that says Vivian Arana. So I'm going to use user 1, password 1, login, and if you see this node 1, node 2, node 3 is by user id 1. It has all these edit delete option. If I, let me make it bigger now, if I select edit today, okay, and if you see that it updated. If I want to delete something, that is deleted. If I go and refresh again, it will log me out, login, and if you see only 2 of them. So the data actually persists. If you look at your terminal, you'll probably see, since we are not enabled debugging, but if you go back to your db.json, you'll see there's only 3 nodes, 1, 3, and 4. One of them is missing. Why? Because we deleted it. It updates the file. The JSON server updates the file. If I create a new node, hi, this is actually, let me log out in this case and use the user to pass to login. This is node by user to new, add node, and you'll probably see it here. Also, you'll see it here. There is one more added, and it created an ID automatically, auto-generated an ID for it, and it said user ID 2 added this node. So there you go. So we have this entire functionality of adding nodes, logging out the user, and making sure that we have a complete application where you can user 1 login, you can add, edit, delete, and also update. So this edit is update, delete. So we have all the CRUD operations where we are creating, we are reading data, we are editing. R is for reading, U for updating, which is editing, and D is for deleting. So all the CRUD operations inside one single application. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thank you.